Hello everyone, this is the European Environment Agency's Ask an Expert chat live from Copenhagen. My name is Antti and I'm here with two of my colleagues, Joana Lobo Vicente and Catherine Ganzleben, who are experts in our today's topic, which is chemicals and health. And we touch upon also on some environmental issues related to chemicals. I'll let you do the introductions to today's topic more in depth, but we have two projects, one that we have kind of wrapped up and another one that is starting right now. The first one was called Human Biomonitoring for EU, HBM for EU, which has just been concluded, and then there's a follow-up project called PARC. Maybe you can start by actually, well, let's frame the topic in a more broad way. How big of an issue is chemicals in Europe, and how do they affect our health?
Thank you, Antti, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone. So, as you mentioned, HBM4U, the Human Biomonitoring Initiative in Europe, is just being wrapped up now. And we had a conference at the end of April in Brussels where we showed the results that we had, made the links to policy, also showed what we had done with focus groups. So we also are interested in knowing what the citizens think about chemical awareness and how they would like to see more information. So we had an exhibition there as well, showing also some of our other products, policy briefs, and the publications that we have done. Regarding PARC, that is something that will follow HBM4U, and we will mention that in a minute. But regarding how much at risk we are, historically we have investigated more PCBs and heavy metals, and currently we have very good legislation in Europe to protect us from those chemicals.
And PCB is a group of chemicals or a type of chemicals?
Yes, it's a group of chemicals.
That we use for something?
They're emitted unintentionally from industrial processes.
Okay, yeah. So these are like emissions to air and water as well? Okay.
So we have very good chemicals legislation, and we have done a lot of progress in the last few years, but we have more and more chemicals that are being produced. We need chemicals in our daily lives. Mm-hmm. If you think back to what you did this morning, you woke up, you had a shower, shampoo, you used shampoo, soap, or shower gel, then you brushed your teeth, used moisturizer. So there are chemicals everywhere. Even if you go out and walk your dog or you run to work, you're exposed to chemicals in the environment as well, in the air that you breathe. So we are trying to understand what are the health effects that chemical exposure is having in humans, in our human health, and in the environment.
Okay. And if we think about the different types of chemicals, what are the ones that we think now are the most risky ones?
Dangerous ones, yeah. So we have a category of chemicals that's called endocrine disrupting chemicals, also known as EDCs. Yeah. And in this category, these chemicals, they affect your hormones in your body, and they also affect your fertility, not just women, but also men. Yeah. There are chemicals that have been related to this spermageddon, for example, and these chemicals are bisphenols, which you can find in inks and thermal paper, for example, at the receipts in shops. You also have phthalates, which are plasticizers. So phthalates are what causes the plastics to be malleable. You also have PFAS, which are perfluorinated compounds, and these are compounds that render products to be waterproof. You also have flame retardants and pesticides. So we are also looking at these chemicals.
So it's a quite broad group of things where we know already that there are some risks, and then there are some chemicals that maybe we suspect that this could be an issue, and then some things where we just don't know a whole lot about them.
Indeed, I think, as Joana said, there are over 100,000 chemicals at least on the market in products in Europe, and then we also have chemicals being emitted from industrial processes. And of those, we understand very well the potential risks associated with a small fraction. So there's quite a large unknown that we kind of see like an iceberg, right? An iceberg of unknown. And that's where we're really trying to increase the understanding and information so that we can better understand what the risks might be to health and also how we can manage them.
Right. So basically we have a whole lot of chemicals around us that make our modern lives look the way it looks right now. We use different cleaning products, cosmetics.
Yes.
There are chemicals in clothing that make it waterproof.
In
or
furniture, flame
furniture.
retardants, pesticides.
All sorts of things, and only for a small fraction of those we know them quite well, and we know that some of them are dangerous to our health and the environment, and there's a big part of chemicals where we don't know much about them.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that chemicals that are sort of acutely toxic, where if you're exposed to them you immediately get ill, we do have a very good understanding of, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what we see is that in our daily lives, as Joana explained, we're exposed to so many chemicals at very low volumes, but over our lifespan. And so it's this kind of long-term chronic exposure to very low doses of mixtures of chemicals, which is now really coming into focus as a concern.
Yes. And I think at this point I want to remind people watching us online, either on LinkedIn or Twitter, to either comment or ask questions in the relevant fields on those platforms, and then I'll ask them from Joana and Catherine, who are our experts today. Let's go back to the human biomonitoring for EU, because this was a project really to increase our knowledge about our exposure to chemicals and what impacts they may have. Can you explain a bit what was the reasoning behind this project and what the who was involved and how it was carried out?
Sure. So as we said earlier, there is a fairly large unknown, a big question mark about not just what chemicals we're exposed to as humans, so which chemicals are in our bodies, and we do all have chemicals in our bodies, but also what the impacts might be on our health. So the goal of this project was to get an understanding across Europe of what chemicals people are exposed to, so what you and I and Joana have in our bodies, by sampling our blood or our urine or our hair, and then analysing it to identify chemicals in our bodies.
And that's why it's called human biomonitoring.
Exactly.
It's about people, and it's about our biomonitoring is about finding out what's in our bodies.
So it really makes pollution personal, right? Because it's about our personal exposure. That was one dimension, and then we also wanted to understand what the impacts are on health. So really looking into the evidence and saying, how might this drive different types of disease, or for example affect fertility, lead to obesity, a whole range of different disease outcomes, and really starting to try and link the individual exposures to those outcomes. Another really critical issue is, as we said earlier, we're exposed to a cocktail of chemicals every day, and starting to understand what those mixtures of chemicals are in the human body, because chemicals don't act in isolation. If you have a mixture of chemicals in your body, they can actually work synergistically, so the impact of the group of chemicals is bigger than the individual chemicals.
So if we analyze just one chemical, we may not see any effects, but then if we take into account that we're exposed to a mix of these things over a long period of time, then you might have some involved.
And we have some really exciting evidence coming out, I think, about impacts of endocrine disruptors on male sperm production, where in the last 50 years we've seen a significant decline of up to 40% in the quality of male sperm in Europe.
We've seen in the news often,
Yeah, and we're linking that to exposure to groups of chemicals that disrupt the male endocrine system, also in very young men, and also in fetuses in the womb. And we're now building the evidence that shows that may be responsible for these declines in sperm quality.
This sounds like a massive undertaking because it's so broad as well. But there were many partners involved in this, and EEA played a part. Can you tell about that?
Sure. So we have about 30 countries that are part of HBM4U. We have most of the member states, but also Iceland and Israel as well, North Macedonia as well as part of the project. So we have quite a lot of players here. What was the other question? Sorry, Antti.
Yeah, so what was the EEA's role?
Yes.
And what kind of, because the countries were involved, but then there were some institutes in those countries that all brought their own expertise to the project.
Yes. So this project is being funded by the European Commission and also by the member states. So some institutions are doing the research and others are making the links to the government, so to the national policies. Our role as an EU institution is to ensure that the research results are uptaken by policy. Mm-hmm. So we were coordinating one of the roles we had was regarding the knowledge hub. So we had to produce targeted communication products to policymakers, to researchers, and also to the citizens. We have a special corner called the Citizens Corner on our website where they can find more information on chemical exposure. And we also were guiding the prioritization of the substances. So we were giving feedback also on what substances we should be looking at, the ones that had more interest, the ones that had more societal concern. Yeah.
And you mentioned already some of the outcomes from that project, that we're finding out some interesting things about the endocrine disruptors. What were the key sort of findings that we got from HBM and for you?
So on top of what Catherine has already mentioned, we also realized that the policies that are in place currently, they're effective because we have seen a decline in the chemicals that have been monitoring for some time. We have seen a decline in exposure. So that's really good. So the citizens can rest assured that the policies are there to protect you.
How do you see that? Because the project was only a couple of years. So what do you compare against? What?
Some countries have been running human biomonitoring studies since before the project existed. Yeah. So we do have some
baseline.
Yes, yeah. We are currently with HBM4U. We will produce a baseline against which to measure chemical exposure. Yeah, but then PARC, the follow-up project, will carry on that. That's why it's really important.
Yeah. And we'll come to PARC in just a moment.
But sorry, just so that I can finalize just by saying that on top of that and the policy being effective, we also managed to build this really good infrastructure with the member states in which they can analyze we have laboratories. We set up this laboratory network. So this is really good, and it's a really good outcome of what it's like to be involved in an EU project.
Right, exciting. We have a question from Noelia, who's asking, we touched upon this a little bit already, but she's asking what are deemed the most dangerous chemicals to our health and environment. We talked about health already a bit. Is there anything you can say about environment and how if those two are kind of go hand in hand? Anything from the HBM4EU where did we find out that okay, these are the substances that we really need to focus on in the future, or anything like that?
Maybe I can start and then you follow up. So I mean, I think it's a really good question. And I would say that the chemicals that are most hazardous to our health are often these persistent pollutants that are toxic. Yeah. And those include a lot of heavy metals like lead and mercury, but also, like Joana mentioned at the beginning, dioxins, PCBs, persistent organic pollutants. And we know quite a lot about those chemicals, and they are well regulated. So we have regulation both at EU level but also at global level to manage emissions of those substances, and many of the most hazardous substances are banned and well regulated in Europe. So I think we're at a place now where we now have many new chemicals that have come onto the market in the last sort of 25 years. And we're beginning to get a more sophisticated understanding of how long-term exposure to, for example, endocrine disruptors can impact our health. I would say that one property in chemicals that's really of concern is persistence. And that means basically it's a chemical that doesn't break down in the environment or in human health. Yeah. It persists, it continues. Yeah. And what can happen then is that it bioaccumulates, which means that it accumulates in the food chain. So very small microbes in water consume that chemical, and then they're eaten by a bigger fish, and then the volumes increase as you go up the food chain. And what can happen then is that humans then eat fish, like for example, particularly large fish that are hunters, like tuna or swordfish.
And mercury is a good example.
Mercury is an example, but also other persistent pollutants. And now we have a lot of concern about a group of chemicals called PFAS, which is over 3,000 different chemicals which have this persistence properties, and that there's a real focus on these chemicals now because we see evidence of health effects.
Because they kind of flow in the environment until they get then eaten by like if they get stuck in a tissue and then we eat fish or some other
so they pass up the food chain as the different species consume each other, and then they bioaccumulate, so you don't excrete them in your urine or your feces. They build up particularly in the fatty tissue, and then you, as humans, we then consume them in fish, also in other wild animals, and particularly for women then we store it in our fatty tissue. And when we have babies and we breastfeed, it then passes from our milk to the babies, who are, of course, very vulnerable at that early stage of development.
With mercury, it causes cognitive impairment. With PFAS, it's a carcinogenic. It can also cause birth defects. Just to mention, and also another chemical, chromium-6, which perhaps our viewers have heard in the Erin Brockovich movie. It was being used as an anti-corrosive in an industrial plant, and it was being released into the environment. So that population there was consuming the water and using the soil, and they were getting contaminated and had cancer problems. With PFAS, there's also a very recent movie, if they are interesting, called Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo. It's very good. And it shows a little bit what this man-made chemical can do to the environment and to the health of.
It's a documentary or?
It's a movie. It's not a documentary. No.
Excellent.
It's also based on a real story. So it's really interesting.
Good. Before we move into talking about the next project, PARC, we have a few more questions, and I think I'll just ask a couple of them, and then you can see what to answer first and who answers what. So this is from Gasper. He's asking about educating children about chemical exposure and awareness in schools. Are there some best practices about that? And then we have a question from Sigrid. Are EU Green Deal targets 2030 to 2050 regarding usage of chemicals strong enough to help nature ecosystems recover? How much pressure is put on large EU chemical companies? So we can talk about the EU legislation and what the EU is doing in this area. And then there's a question from Sepideh. Can we eliminate chemical pollution with nanomethods? So there's some technology involved in that. It's not really what we work on, but maybe you've heard something. And there's a question from Konstantinos asking about the social impacts of chemical substances. Could civil engagement and awareness provide any solution to persistent chemical compounds found in the environment? So it goes back a little bit to the education and awareness, I guess, as well.
Maybe I can answer the first and the last questions.
And I'll take the middle ones.
So regarding the education in schools, we do not foresee to go to schools and educate the children. That's not something that's in the scope of HBM4U nor PARC. However, we do have one of the objectives is to communicate to citizens, and that is a way of educating the citizens. So in HBM4U, we have on the website www.hbm4.eu.eu.
We'll post these links, so in case you didn't catch that, we'll post these links.
If you go on the website, there's on top a tab on Citizens Corner, and you can find there a lot of information that we've produced that's to communicate to the citizens. So we have done fact sheets, very simple lay language term, informing the citizens how you get exposed to certain chemicals. We are monitoring in HBM4U about 18 chemicals, all of them we've mentioned here. So you can go there and you can see, you can read on how you get exposed to it, what the legislation is doing to protect you, how you can avoid exposure as well. So perhaps then you can bring that to your school if you're a teacher, or show that to your children at home.
So there's a lot of resources that we
Yes.
make available that
Yes.
could be
Yeah.
useful.
And we also have infographics which are based on these fact sheets. So these are just one-pagers with images and short information. We also have animated videos to explain how the body, what is HBM for you, then how the body takes up chemicals. We have a few of these videos on the website. And then we also produce these short capsule videos on each one of the substances, explaining what we are doing in terms of research on these substances. These are very short, less than 4-minute videos, also available in the Citizens Corner. So I really encourage the citizens to go there and check. Regarding sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that I think there's a growing awareness about
Yes.
chemicals, and I think people look for
Yes.
solutions and look for products that don't have the chemicals that we know already that are harmful.
Yes.
So I think there's a momentum for this,
Yeah.
which kind of links to the last question.
But it's also good to share and tell the citizens where they can get that information. So I also encourage you to follow us on social media, on LinkedIn and on Facebook and Twitter, because we do share quite a few updates there. We also, regarding the last question, which was also on the citizens,
social engagement and
yes, we have actually just recently published a second publication on focus groups. So we have done focus groups on several countries in the EU, and so it's really interesting because we have the quotes of the citizens there, and we can understand from that the citizens want to be informed. It's not because they're not scientists that they don't want to know what's happening, and you don't really need to be that technical to explain in a few words what a chemical does and how you can avoid being exposed to it. So we do have this factor into account. So yes.
Anything about the EU action? I've heard being said that the EU is the place, Europe is the place in the world where we have the most advanced chemical legislation already. And you said before that we actually see some evidence that this is actually doing a pretty good job in terms of protecting citizens. What about going forward? Where are we?
Yeah, so under the European Green Deal, the Commission has put forward what they're calling a chemical strategy for sustainability. And it is a really progressive, forward-looking strategy. So we are actually delighted with that and really looking forward to actively supporting it. And there's a couple of dimensions that really are important. So it was a great question from Sigrid. One is that instead of looking at controlling chemicals once they're emitted to the environment and health, so kind of trying to manage exposure, we're now looking upstream, and we're looking at making sure that we only produce chemicals that are what we call safe and sustainable by design. So this means we're looking at producing chemicals that do not have hazardous properties, so they're not toxic to human health and the environment. It's not straightforward, because often we look for chemicals that are persistent in order to, for example, make chairs hard or make products durable or make them waterproof or fat-proof. But it really introduces a new concept and a new way of thinking and says, yes, we can do things differently. It's going to take a lot of effort, particularly in industrial value chains, right through from chemical producers down to suppliers, in order to manifest this. But there's a lot of investment being made at European level, also in research and development to make this happen. Another point I would make is that the Commission is pushing to eliminate hazardous substances from consumer products, which is also fantastic. It links a bit to this idea of making chemicals safe. They're also looking at addressing a strategy that I must admit the chemical industry adopts, which is the chemical industry puts one chemical on the market, like bisphenol A, and that chemical becomes the subject of attention, we see health effects, and then it becomes banned. And the response is to pick a very similar chemical like bisphenol F, where they've changed one atom of the chemical structure. And inevitably then we produce evidence over years that shows that it has health effects, and then we ban that chemical. But this, as you can see, this game of whack-a-mole takes time. And the approach now in Europe is to look at groups of chemicals. that have similar properties and then address them and ban them and restrict them in groups, so that we really move away from this industry approach.
Well, we have reasonable amount of knowledge already that this is not.
Yeah, and we know that a certain chemical structure is associated with impacts on environment and health, and we say, you know what, we're not going to have chemicals with that structure, we're going to move away and find a solution that's safe. I would mention one other thing, which is pesticides. Pesticides is a really controversial issue. Obviously, pesticides are chemicals that are designed to kill organic organisms. You know, they're designed to kill pests. You know, however different we may be from an insect, we do share some metabolic processes.
Then it's in itself is quite worrying already. Like some of these things we make to make things waterproof, for example, and then it's a side effect that it also is harmful for us. These are actually things that are designed to harm living organisms. So,
Indeed. And I mean, you know, I don't want to scaremonger, but at the same time, it is one of the areas where we see major impacts on ecosystems, particularly impacts on insect populations, and of course insects play very important roles in ecosystems in breaking down organic matter, but also in pollinating, which is really important for our food systems. Now, at the moment with the war in Ukraine, we have, of course, a discourse that's very valid, which is focused on food security in Europe. And some of the lobbyists are using this as an opportunity to say we should not reduce our use of pesticides because we need food security. Now, I have two responses on that. So the first one is we see that pesticides affect pollinators, which is also a threat to our food security going forward. And secondly, and perhaps controversially, in Europe, very large areas of our agricultural land are used to produce feed for animals, which we then consume as meat. So we do have choices, right? If we shift away from meat consumption, not necessarily completely, but just reducing the amount of meat that we consume, we can use some of that land to grow much larger volumes of food that can feed more people, and in that way solve our food security questions.
Indeed. And there are like this one, there are other solutions than using more chemicals, including for products. There was this question about nanotech, but I think you kind of indirectly answered that already, that the focus is now kind of upstreaming and avoiding putting those chemicals there in the first place. Or is nanotech a technology the way you can potentially use that to avoid using chemicals, or
nanotech is chemicals, so they're nanomaterials are regulated under the same legislation, REACH it's called, and I would say nanomaterials do give a whole range of functionalities. They're not necessarily a substitute for example, pesticides. They would also then be a form of pesticide, so they're kind of within the same group. But there are also some concerns about nanomaterials, and it really links to whether they're bound within a structure, like a lot of sports materials now include nanomaterials, but they don't escape, they stay in that structure, or if they're used in a sort of liquid form or more readily dispersed, because then they can go into the environment, and then you can have similar concerns.
There's also a concern with nanomaterials that they go in your body, and that they can also disturb certain metabolisms that you have. So those things are also currently being studied.
I guess generally chemicals on let's say surfaces of a table or something like that, that's in principle less risky than something that I would inhale or intake or eat and get in my body. That's kind of links to the nanomaterials as well.
Yeah, in terms of the exposure routes, I mean, I think there's a whole range of different ways you can be exposed, as Joana hinted at the beginning. I mean, diet is a really important exposure route because we consume our food, and there we can be exposed to residues of pesticides, but also food contaminants. For example, if you've grown food in your own back garden, it's really important to be aware of how that soil may have been used in the past and whether it's been contaminated. It's probably smarter to buy some fresh peat soil that you're more sure of the quality, and grow food for your family in that rather than the soil in your back garden. Occupational exposure is also really important, and where we see the biggest health impacts, I would see, where workers are working in generally industry, in the metals industry, also in all sorts of production sectors using chemicals.
Because it makes a difference if you're working on something say 40 hours per week with cleaning products, for example, as opposed to cleaning occasionally at home, even if you.
But there's also protective gear that you can use when you work in a factory, or if you are exposed from an occupational point of view. So it's also important for the workers to know that using protective gear, maybe they will be a little bit slow at doing their job, but at least they know that they're being protective, and what's the price you put on your health, really, right? And there was also something about the okay, it slipped my mind. Sorry.
It's okay. I think we'll move on a little bit to the PARC project, because we haven't talked about that yet.
Yes.
So this is a follow-up to the human biomonitoring project. Can you say in a few words what this project is about? And then
Sure.
we have a few more questions that we're going to come to.
So PARC is a much bigger project in the sense that it will have the part of human biomonitoring, but also the part of risk assessment, and we will also carry on with the infrastructures that have been built upon in HBM4U, and we'll try to perhaps expand those and further cement what already exists. So we will be carrying on with the legacy of HBM4U and further develop that. And it's a project that will last for 7 years.
Okay.
So yeah.
Exciting. And PARC stands for the European Partnership for the Assessment of Risks from Chemicals.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a walk in the park.
Yeah. And what else is because you're leading a group that is working on air pollution and health and environment and these connected issues. What else is EEA doing in this area of chemicals and health?
Yeah, so we have quite a wide range of activities, as you hint at. So we look at air quality, and we have the latest data on air quality from across more than 33 countries in Europe. And then we estimate the impacts of air pollution on health. We also have data on emissions of pollutants from industrial installations, which allows us to have a picture of which kind of sectors are producing the most pollution and how that impacts on human health. And we have a website called EPRTR where you can look at your local neighborhood and you can see where there's a factory close by and what they're emitting, if that's of interest to you. On chemicals, we also work on chemical impacts on ecosystems, so not just the human health dimension, but also looking at, for example, pesticides in the environment, and other chemicals in the environment. And there we have monitoring data reported to us from our member countries.
Very exciting. We have, I think, 2 more questions, and one is actually linked to what you just said about different sectors and their emissions. So asking about the 3 or 5 or the biggest sources of hazardous chemicals, if you look at the economic sectors. Can you say something about that, or maybe link it to, like if we think about industry or transport, these are all sources of air pollution as well. Which are the type of chemicals as well that
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty tricky question because, like you say, it depends very much what we're talking about. So, I mean, if we're talking about releases of pesticides, releases of chemicals into the environment, that's agriculture for sure, right? Because there we're spreading pesticides and fertilizers directly onto land. So that's a really large volume of chemicals that are placed on ecosystems every year.
Which then also end up in waters.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in terms of consumer products, I would say cleaning products are really important because, again, they're pretty much thrown down the drain and they're very toxic chemicals because the idea is that they disinfect and kill biological organisms because that's what we want them to do, and they're extremely important in our sanitation systems. Cosmetics, you know, we put them on our bodies and they also get washed down the drain. Pharmaceuticals are often overlooked, and again, these chemicals are bioactive, so they're designed to have an effect on our metabolism, and we should never flush pharmaceuticals down the toilet, but unfortunately people sometimes do. They also come out of our urine, or at least breakdown products do, and there's particular concern about antimicrobial resistance, which we see in areas where we have large releases of antimicrobial drugs into the environment. Then we see the growth of antimicrobial resistance, which is a massive concern for health.
The overuse of antibiotics It's not only
Indeed.
for you, but also ends up in wastewater and then in the, in the environment.
And I would add there, it's not just about human use, it's also veterinary use. Particularly in animal husbandry, where we have seen in Europe a fall in the volumes, but it's still a significant use and release into the environment.
Very good. I have one last question. This is from Sigrid. Might be a little bit tricky one, but this is about the EU taxonomy and the sustainability criteria. And do you know if chemical pollution has been somehow part of that? I know this is not really the area that you're working on, but yeah.
Yeah, so there was a process at European level on the taxonomy for sustainability, particularly for sustainable finance, right?
Exactly.
And that involved discussions at European level. We were part of those discussions. The final decision was with the Commission and the Member States. And we did definitely feed in information on chemicals, particularly this concept of safe and sustainable by design as being part of what contributes to the taxonomy of what is sustainable. Yeah. So we fed that in, and it is a dimension of those regulations.
Very good. I think those were the questions we had today. Any final words you want to say to our viewers?
I think just to wrap up, I'm very excited. I think we're all very excited with the new project with PARC because it's going to be very progressive. We really want to make decisive and important contributions to the chemicals legislation to protect the environment and the health of our citizens. So,
that's very good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and thanks to our audience and all the questions you asked. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, I hope, with another topic. So thank you for today, and have a good week.